Good afternoon, everyone. This is the December 20th, 2008 muster of the Texas Militia. Welcome to all of you who attended today. I'm going to talk to you today about several issues of special concern to militia that deserve your attention. Now, this mock-up is intended to represent one of the great threats to national security. It represents a suitcase nuke, which we have reason to believe may have already been smuggled into the United States by elements of Al-Qaeda or their sympathizers. Now, a real suitcase nuke is larger than this. This is a conveniently sized box. A 5 kiloton device would be about half again as large and weigh about 60 pounds. A 100 kiloton device is too big normally for one guy to carry. It's about 300 pounds and about the size of a foot locker. We don't know what size devices may have been smuggled in, or even for sure if they were. The information apparently comes from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the chief architect of the 9/11 attack. But how reliable that information might be, it's hard to say. A lot of the rest of what he said is reliable, and we need to take it seriously. Now, the odds of any of us encountering a real suitcase nuke are, of course, very small. However, it's worth thinking about because we might be the ones who first, because we're vigilant to the subject, draw attention to it, even if we don't have a chance to deal with it ourselves. And certainly, we can help get our friends and neighbors vigilant on the subject as well. Now, what we have here is a diagram of the interior of the typical device. It is similar to the designs used by our military, and we believe is nearly the same as that of the Soviet suitcase nukes, that about 40 of which are unaccounted for. What you have is essentially a gun inside the case. The two red outlined areas are the two halves of the plutonium core. The area here on the end is a high explosive, and along the edges here are what are called neutron enhancers, typically lithium, which when the two halves come together, flood the small region around it with enough extra neutrons to cause a high percentage of the plutonium to fission and not just be dispersed by the initial burst of radiation. Down here, or it could be up here, but for the sake of argument we'll put it down here, is the control mechanism. In the diagram that I sent you by email, this was referred to as a switch. Well, it's not really a switch as such. It's usually some kind of countdown timer. And normally there will be a combination lock securing the entire package. It's not a case of having this red wire, blue wire type of issue like in the movies. If you could get into it, you could easily disarm it. So it's not a great mystery in that sense. The problem, and they're probably not going to set it up so that putting in the wrong combination would set it off, because that would make it too dangerous for the people who moved it around to actually use it. But there is a risk of, if you can't get into it that if you don't take the right moves, you could set it off. Now, the question is, how do you know when you might get one? Well, you would probably be working from clues as to the behavior of someone you found with it, or that led you to it. Obviously, if it's a Middle Eastern guy who sounds like he's out to wipe out millions of people, maybe he's bragging about it, maybe he gets drunk, who knows what he might do. That's a clue. The case itself does provide some radiation shielding. The main radiation you need to be looking for is gamma radiation, and it comes from the two cores, or half cores. So if you had a gamma detector and passed it around over a device and it was hotter here and here, that would be a really strong clue, well enough to justify taking further action. Now, what is further action? Well, first of all, if you reasonably think you can, and if you find it in a populated area, you need to move it out of a populated area carefully, but also quickly, because it could be on a countdown timer. You get as far away from a populated area as you can, because even a 5 kiloton device can take out hundreds of thousands of people in a populated area. And if you happen to find a 100 kiloton device, you're talking about something that could take out millions, especially if it's in the middle of a major city. If you could find not only a location that's far away from a populated area, but also some kind of a depression like a mine or gully or pit, something like that, that's even better. Now, you may not have a chance to do any of that, but if you could fire a high caliber round, preferably a 50 cal, but if you don't have it, 30-06 may be able to do it, you may be able to penetrate and disable the triggering mechanism. Now, there's some speculation on whether you could also fire it through the gun case and disable it, disrupt this area so the two halves can't come together. There is reason to doubt that a 30-06 could do that. A 50 cal could. You'd be safe to put it right through the middle with a 50 cal. But other than that, you're probably looking at firing one through here and through here in case the mechanism is up in this corner. Now, generally speaking, the clue as to that will be the distribution of mass within the case. We're talking about it being heavier on this end and on this side. And if it is heavier on this side than on this side, the chances are the triggering mechanism is down here, because it adds some weight of its own. If it's heavier on this side, then it's probably up here. So that by kind of shifting the weight around, you can get a sense, you can try to balance it to see where the center of mass is. Now, obviously, if we can possibly avoid it, we don't want to try to deal with it ourselves. However, I'm assuming, for the sake of this discussion, that it's going to be an emergency situation where we can't bring in the professionals. Now, if we could bring in the professionals, I sent you a link to the website for the branch of the Department of Energy that is supposed to deal with these things. The problem, then, they have, in principle, teams that they can bring onto almost any location in a matter of a couple of hours. The problem is that if you were to call them and they didn't know who you were, you'd have a credibility problem. They're not going to send a team out just on the basis of a report from some unknown citizen. Now, if you can involve local law enforcement to lend you some credibility, that might be helpful, but it also represents a cost of time. You may not have time to do that. You might even have to do something like, you know, just declare yourself to be local law enforcement, and by the time they figure out you're not, they've got a team on the scene, they're dealing with the problem. But whatever it takes, remember the number, you can memorize it. It's 1-800-DIAL-DOE. That's like DOE, Department of Energy. Think of a female deer. So, what are the odds that there are such things in this country? We don't know. The report that we got was 6 or 7 of them. Now the fact that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed may not have known for sure whether it was 6 or 7 is itself suspicious, but it also lends credibility to it, because it means that he was sufficiently distant from the actual operation to know about it without knowing the details. Now the sources also indicate that the actual smuggling was done by members of Mara Salvatruch's 13, MS-13. That's a criminal gang that originated in Los Angeles, composed of Salvadorian expatriates. And it's also very strong in El Salvador. It's a vicious gang. They'll carry anything for anybody, and there's reason to believe that they were used as a conduit into the United States. Now, when I've discussed this with federal contacts, and they approached me on this, so I have to take it seriously for that reason alone. They're not going to approach me idly. They are of the opinion that the reason why the devices have not already been set off is because they're not operational. I don't believe that. I think Al-Qaeda is smart enough that if they're going to smuggle in devices, it's because they know they work. And there's reason to believe that they have not only acquired the devices, but personnel to maintain them. And these things are not don't have a short shelf life like the nukes that we use in our missiles. They're designed to be put in place, hidden in a location, and left there for decades and still be usable. So it's very likely that the devices are still operational. The odds of them going off with a full yield might be somewhat reduced, but the main effect of time deterioration would be to reduce the yield, not to make it less likely that they'll fire. Okay? Now I'd like to move on a little bit from this subject. I'll hold this up here for a little while so you can kind of burn it into your minds. There are many other threats of this kind that we need to be cognizant of. We, of course, all remember the anthrax attacks. That is primarily an intelligence problem. Dealing with the actual attack itself, once it's underway, is very difficult for anybody, professionals or lay militiamen as well. That is mostly a matter of being vigilant. And you need to be vigilant to things like, if you're involved with civil aviation, make sure that people lock their airplanes, especially their crop dusters. Better yet, to disable them when they're not in use, so that somebody just can't come in, steal them, and fill the tanks with some chemical or biological agent and use them to spread death and destruction. Okay, these are some of the great threats. Now, there has already been efforts in this direction. There's a lot of excitement about that for a while, and for a long time, a lot of people who had such aircraft took measures, most of them, to secure their aircraft. But that situation has relaxed in the last 5 or 6 years or so, and one of the best things we can do as militia is to recruit and get involved people in aviation First of all, we need an aviation wing. I'm a pilot myself, there may be some other pilots in the group, but also because of the potential damage the aircraft can do in the wrong hands. And we need to make sure that we have that base covered to the extent that's possible. Now, as I said, much of it is a matter of vigilance. Knowing the people around you, knowing your neighbors, knowing casual acquaintances, keeping your eyes open. Now, you don't want to just become a squad of informants. One of the things that you learn if you've ever gotten involved in some of these reserve officers corps or civilian police training operations is that they try to turn the civilians into just extensions of their informant networks. They don't want you to do anything, they want you to tell them everything about everybody, and that makes you really part of the problem. The key difference of the militia paradigm is that we deal with situations ourselves unless it's a situation that's we can't cope with. But we do not in general involve higher level authorities unless it's really critical. If you're merely suspicious of your neighbors, that's not grounds to report them or turn them in. We don't want another McCarthy era, another Red Scare like we had in the early 50s. I'm old enough to remember that period when every day you hear on the radio, you know, your neighbor may be a communist. If you think he is, you know, report him to the FBI. We don't want that. If we start indulging in that kind of national paranoia, we will have been doing to ourselves what the enemy is trying to do to us. So we need to preserve our liberties at the same time that we're defending them. But we do need to preserve our liberties. And that means that ideally we're eventually going to get so many people involved in militia that we can actually know who all our neighbors are well enough to pick out any that might be a threat. And that's not always easy, but sometimes it is. I have actually joined groups of Muslims, most of whom are good Americans, loyal, you know, ready to fight for this country, but once in a while you can hear some of them talking and it's not friendly. And those are the guys you got to watch, because what the few people are doing are they're coming in, they're trying to recruit from among the good Muslims, good American Muslims, for their cause. And most of our good American Muslims are not ready psychologically to resist that kind of thing. They are too trusting. And we need to encourage them to be a little bit more paranoid so that they don't get sucked into something and wind up becoming the victims of something that is, you know, that they're really don't deserve to be involved in, but could have avoided if they had been paying more attention. So, a few of the things I wanted to discuss is, you know, this is our second meeting this year at this location. But this muster is essentially for the entire state. And what I would like to see, of course, at a statewide muster is the kind of turnout that we had in 1994 and 95. 95, we got as many as 800 at a muster in San Antonio. Okay, we filled Alamo Plaza. So it was a big deal. Now we could do that again, but we need to aim toward that. And now the way that we were able to do that is because we had enough units in each of several counties to make up that number. At one point, we probably had between 10 and 20,000 people who showed up at musters in various counties in the state. That was at the height of it. And when we conducted an election for the Committee of Safety in South Central Texas, about 2% of the voting age population showed up to vote, and they seemed to know who they were voting for. So I think we can count that number as among those who would be likely to show up in the event of a real crisis. But that's still only a small percentage. It can be enough. The American Revolution was fought with only about 2% of the population, although they had the support of about another third. About another third were loyal to Britain, and the remaining third were mostly neutral, except, at least at the beginning of the Revolution, toward the end of the Revolution, they joined the Revolution, because the Loyalists were so brutal and abusive that they alienated the rest of the population, and finally that's what really turned the tide. It became impossible for the British to supply their troops off the land. They had to depend on ships to bring in food and supplies from England in order to man their, to supply their personnel, which would largely confine them to coastal cities. So they lost control of the interior. Now, so if we could get even 3% participation, I mean, that would be wonderful. That would be more than we get votes for libertarian candidates in statewide elections, which are, generally speaking, about the same people. But we need to build it on a core of regular attendance at these musters. If I'm not recording this gathering today, and frankly, because I don't want to start doing that until we can show large numbers. When we can show large numbers, then we can put it on the web, and it will begin to have an impact. Merely showing up at these musters has a huge impact. We never have to fire a weapon, even in practice, just to have a solid, important impact on the course of political events. Our mere gathering, the existence of our organization, the fact that we're here and getting ready, the word gets out about that, a lot of things change. The reason why we haven't had any more Wacos or Ruby Ridges is because after Waco, the militia movement got organized. And ever since then, the powers that be have been terrified of an armed uprising by the American people. This scenario has been wargamed on more than one occasion. The military has conducted war games in which it was the military against the armed civilian population. And guess what? The armed civilian population always won. And one of the reasons why they almost always won, besides of course that they were more numerous and outgunned the regular military, because they had so many veterans among them who could provide training and leadership with the skills they had acquired in military combat training and experience, but also that they had a very, very high refusal to obey rate among their own personnel. You know, it's very hard to put down a population if you give an order and your own troops turn against you. That was what brought down, remember, the Soviet Union. When the Russian White House was besieged by tanks and troops, when Yeltsin stood on a tank, that was a critical moment in the Soviet Union. The order was given to fire on Yeltsin and the supporters of democratic reform in Russia. The troops refused to obey that order, and the whole thing came tumbling down. That was the fall of the Soviet Union. And it all started with troops, the local commanders, who refused to fire on their own people and who instead joined them. So, now of course, one of the things that the Red Army did not succeed in doing was demonizing Yeltsin and his Democratic supporters. And the problem that we would be confronting today is that the troops would be brainwashed to believe that the civilians were a bunch of terrorists. So the civilians need to present themselves as good, honest, loyal Americans who are defending their rights, defending their country, and that they are the good guys. And it's very important that as militia, we train our people and be prepared to train the civilians who may suddenly show up in large numbers, that you do not start a gunfight. All right? It's better to take some losses, more than a few, to get to the point where the tide of public sympathy is on our side. Only after they've murdered some of us in significant numbers are we going to be able to fire back and expect to have the population support us. So keep that in mind. It will be a great temptation if you're fired upon in a situation like that to return fire immediately, and for the sake of your country, your Constitution, you may want to refrain from doing that and eat that bullet. So the way to organize local militia units is fairly well understood, but it's the key skill that all of you need to learn. Everyone needs to organize a unit in your local county. And after you organize one, you go and organize another one and another one. It's okay for counties to have more than one unit. They can place against each other in softball or something to build up camaraderie. We had 2 units in Bexar County for a while, for example. And certainly for urban counties, that's appropriate. For rural counties, 1 unit per county may work out okay. Ideally, okay, when this country was founded, very few counties had more than 3,000 people. In today's America, with 300 million people, 3,000 people is about a voting precinct. So if you look around you when you go to vote, assuming you do it in person, at the people that are there, they represent what should be a militia unit. Now, I've also argued that if we were to organize our country right, we would also organize precincts into townships, into communities, each with its own local government, its own chief law enforcement officer, its own judge, its own grand jury, and so forth, to move government down to the level of about 3,000 people per community. Because at that level, everybody can know everybody else, and you can exercise the duties of our society at a more effective level. Once you get more than about, 10 or 12,000, then you're beginning to think about a community large enough that probably needs more than 1 militia unit. And of course, you're also talking, if we were to do this on an organized national basis, what we'd probably want to do is to have units muster, or people muster, in a staggered way. So everybody with a birth date on the 25th of the month would meet on this day at this location, and those with the 13th of the month at this location, and so forth. That's because you don't want too many people in one place at one time. So these are just a few of the thoughts that I want to send you home with. I want you to have fun while you're here. Militia musters should be fun. There should be an opportunity to build camaraderie, to build unit loyalty. But then you need to carry it back to your communities, to your neighborhoods. Now, you may not initially want to approach your neighbors with the word militia. If you have a neighborhood association, you might want to bring up at the next neighborhood association, or organize a neighborhood association, to discuss the problem of crime, especially in the light of the coming downturn in the economy. Simply thinking in terms of defending themselves against crime is the start in the right direction. Every neighborhood should have a neighborhood watch. The neighborhood watch can be upgraded into a militia. Gradually, step by step, you're moving people along toward being where they need to be. Generally speaking, most people do not come to the point that we are at today in one step. I don't think anybody here probably came to the position you're in now in one day or in one step. It was probably a gradual process. You know, an outrage here, an outrage there, an idea here, a word there. It could gradually build up and kept moving you along. Well, that's the same way with most people. You work a little bit on one person or group of people. You try to figure out first where they are, how far they can go. You try to take them there. Then you move on to another group, and another group, another group. You come back to the first ones to see if they're ready to move forward another step. You keep moving away. It's a little bit like herding, you know, cattle or sheep or other things. You move a few of them along in a little bit, then you go back over, move a few more over, and a few more, come back to these. You keep moving them away together, in little small steps until you finally get them all moving together in the same direction. This can be a frustrating process because you get backsliders and, you know, naysayers and, you know, all kinds of gripers. We used to say in the military that if people aren't griping, they're not happy. But the problem is that's in the military where you can give orders. And when you're talking about volunteers, griping can be a problem. You may want to get the gripers out of the picture so they don't impair morale and unit efficiency. Okay, any questions?
Yes, sir. If a group is ever fired upon by the feds again and they're winning, should they let the feds have a ceasefire to go get more ammunition and pick up their wounded?
It depends so much on the situation. I think that the Davidians actually handled their situation fairly well in that regard because it, more than anything else, won them the sympathy of a lot of Americans. They might have lost that battle and their lives, but they won a larger and more important battle in the hearts and minds of the American people, which continues to this day, and it's probably one of the reasons why many of us are out here. If the Davidians really had fired the first shot and gone out and, you know, chased them down and shot them down as a lie, they wouldn't have that sympathy. So it's very important to apply no more force than is absolutely necessary, and to always keep in mind that the ultimate battle is for the hearts and minds of the people. It's not just for the immediate tactical situation. Any other questions?
On the suitcase nuke there, is the way it works is that the explosion forces two critical masses of plutonium together, and when they hit each other, it creates a critical mass and explodes.
Right.
And if you can keep it from the two pieces from coming together, it won't create a nuclear blast.
That's right. These are called subcritical masses. Now, one of the things you would not want to do is to put a round through the explosive. That could set it off. So you've got to try to figure out where the explosive is, if you can. That's why it's better if you can try to tell by the distribution of mass within the case, And if you do have a radiation detector, if you detect radiation here and here, that provides a pretty good clue. Other than that, you know, this would be an awesome decision to try to disarm one of these things. You know, if you make a mistake, it could cost millions of lives. But if you succeed, you could save millions of lives. And you know, the odd thing is, the world would probably never know it. Even if you survived the situation, you can probably bet that the feds wouldn't want the word to get out that you had done it, that some civilian had saved the city. Because if that were to happen, they would be admitting their impotence and that the validity of the militia message. And also, of course, it would be bad for business. Yeah.
How is the switch wired to the device itself?
Basically, it's a simple, just like setting off any explosive. Here's the explosive. It's high. It's what?
How is it connected?
It's just wires. Yeah, little trigger here at the end.
Like a blasting cap?
So like a blasting cap, yeah. Although it's much more efficient than an ordinary blasting cap. Because remember, this has to propel it at a very high speed. If it's too slow, by the time it gets to the critical point, it will generate so much radiation and heat that it will vaporize the entire assembly. And if it vaporizes it before it can all fission, then you get a very low yield. Now you'll notice the shape of the contact points here. The reason why it's shaped like this, and of course there are variations in this shape, you want to try to get it as far along as you can before it goes critical. Some of the first devices were designed so that you really had this a much deeper pit. So it would go almost all the way in before it finally became critical, and then it was all close together and would fission rather than vaporize and disperse. Now keep in mind that this is plutonium, and plutonium is deadly in itself. So if you were to release any of the plutonium, you would need to cordon off the area, keep people away from it until a cleanup crew could come in. And of course, you'd be at risk yourself. But the key thing is to prevent the device from fissioning, from detonating, and causing the damage that could do. By the way, getting back to the arguments on why I thought that the feds were wrong about why Al-Qaeda hadn't set off these devices. If I were Al-Qaeda, and I think it's useful to try to think like the enemy, I think what they would do is to wait until they had 30 or 40 devices in place in this country before they started setting off the first one. And then set them off at random intervals in random cities. Not just in the major cities like New York or Washington, D.C., but even in little cities, so that nobody would know where the next one would go off. And everybody in the whole country would be panicked. They'd be deserting the cities, flooding into the countryside, running out of food and water there, and creating such a chaotic situation that the entire country would come crashing down. That's the kind of situation that we need to be able to manage to the extent that it can be managed if this threat is to be realized. And of course the thing is that if we're just a bunch of volunteers, out here in the woods, we're not going to have the credibility with our friends and neighbors for them to follow us if the crisis should emerge. So you need to build credibility with your own local neighborhoods, your own local communities. If there is a Rotary Club or a Kiwanis or Elks or Lions, join those things. Become active. Be active in your church. be known to your community. Run for public office. Meet and greet people. Go to country fairs. You know, do everything you can to establish your credibility so that if the shit hits the fan, as the old expression goes, we will be in a position to manage the situation as well as it can be. And we saw a little of that, as I hear from reports, in East Texas during Hurricane Rita, where, as I understand it, a lot of civilians took the initiative to help organize their friends and neighbors to deal with that hurricane. Whereas Hurricane Katrina caused a total breakdown of the social fabric in the area around New Orleans. So how people hang together in a crisis makes all the difference in the world. I saw it in the Loma Prieta earthquake on the San Francisco Peninsula when I was there when it occurred. And it was remarkable how the citizenry all fell together to deal with the situation. The traffic lights were out, somebody would volunteer to direct traffic. Other people volunteered to take food, you know, water, whatever, to anybody who needed it. Organization developed very, very quickly in that situation. Now, what you had in that area were fairly well-educated people, most of them without military experience or experience in other kinds of disaster recovery. But because they were intelligent and well-educated and had a good, strong sense of being bound to the community, they were able to pull it together to think through what had to be done and to respond to the situation. So getting a culture of readiness becomes the critical thing. What we have today in this country is a culture of unreadiness, and we need to change that. And from a culture of readiness, we can develop a culture of strict compliance with the Constitution, because the two to go together very closely. Any other questions? Anybody else want to give a presentation today? We have any motivational speakers who'd like to to motivate the troops? Tell about your experiences?
That's it.
Okay. You can go.